we're approaching every acquisition we do the same, whether it's $1 million acquisition or $100 million acquisition.
Oh,
and
man.
I was like, oh, okay. So, I mean, it took so much longer than I could have imagined.
This is the Startup Different podcast. From scrappy founders to 8-figure success stories, we're busting apart startup myths, getting raw insights from battle-tested entrepreneurs, and revealing the proven playbook for bootstrapping your way to 5 million with no VC strings attached. Today on Startup Different, we talk to our old pal, Chris Memmott. He has over 15 years of sales and leadership experience within high-growth startups and has even had his own, albeit bumpy, exit. We'll cover his journey and what to watch out for when selling your business baby. It's acquisition time on Startup Different. Hello, folks, and welcome to another episode of Startup Different. I am David Singleton. That is Christopher Singleton, and we have another Chris with us today, Chris Memmott. Chris, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, and congrats on the new baby.
Oh, thank you. Yes, baby Luke. Yeah, he's sleeping, sort of. So that's good news. But it's funny, you preempted me. I was going to say we're doing something on the show today that I promised myself I would never do, which is introduce another Chris. And
I'm the only Chris on this show.
So wait a minute, who's this other Chris? But actually, I'm very excited to have another Chris today because Chris Memmott, you've had such an interesting experience. You've had obviously your own company that you had a successful exit from. You've worked in sales with startups for a very long time, and obviously at larger organizations too. And so today, I think for our audience, I want to make sure we're picking your brain on some of those things. But first, before we do that, we'd love to hear sort of like the synopsis of your career, how you got to this point where you are today, and hit us with the highlights.
Great. Well, my background, I've spent the last 16 years working primarily with startups in most of it's been in a sales capacity. I was the founder of a startup, which is the ultimate sales job. Unlike you guys in doing it the smart way, I decided to raise money and pitching to investors before we had a product, and then, pitching to people to come join the company when we had some money to build the product. And then, holy shit, now we got to actually sell the thing.
Oh God.
It never stops. And then we ended up, spoiler alert, selling the business about 6 years into it. And it is the ultimate sales job when you go to other companies and you're pitching and taking in term sheets and negotiating between different buyers, which we were fortunate enough to have 3 term sheets and have that optionality. Yeah.
I had no idea you had 3. I knew you had obviously, we'll talk about your exit in a little bit here, but I didn't realize you had gotten 3 different offers. That's pretty impressive, actually. I think we only had the one, although it did happen twice. So I don't know if it was the same company twice. Yeah. I don't know. How does that work?
We also had like a tire kicker that was kind of...
Yeah, but there was no term sheet.
There was no term sheet though, but yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Cool. Anyway, okay. So let's start at the start though. So let's talk about your that company. Can you go into some specifics for us?
Yeah, happily. So, it all started when I got out of college. I graduated in 2008, right when the economy was just like on fire. So jobs were very few and far between for recent grads.
Yeah.
And I was lucky enough to where I did social work to get myself through college. And I had some offers with insurance companies to actually leverage what I studied and my experience to get a stable job. And then I had an offer from a startup called Public Engines out of Salt Lake City. So I grew up in Utah and went to the University of Utah. And the one offer I had that seemed like it was really risky, I ended up taking it because it was a sales job. I'd never done sales before. Exciting startup working with law enforcement. And go figure, about 3 months after I accepted that job, the insurance company Aetna that had offered me these 2 other positions, they announced that they were laying off everybody in their Salt Lake City office.
Wow. That's crazy. What? Why were they trying to hire? And then later they're just like literally 3 months later they're canning everyone. That's crazy.
It was nuts, and it was right after. It was right around that time when folks are graduating. So they typically, every spring or going in the summer, they do a batch of hiring, and I think that they just, as soon as the economy, I don't know if you guys are too young, but back in 2008, it was just like that. It seemed like as soon as
No.
everything.
So I remember it. I'm not too young. Chris is definitely not too young because I think your origin story isn't that different.
Yeah, I was kind of similar story. It was the 2002 .com bubble when I graduated, and sort of the same story. But like I was the previous recession. I was one recession.
He's one recession back. Yeah, you get a special patch for that, or a little medal that comes in the mail, and one recession deep. So yeah. Okay,
That's
so
right.
so they laid off everybody, and you're working at this startup, and so but you ended up becoming an owner of this startup, correct?
Hey, we're taking a short break to tell you some exciting news. Chris and I wrote a book. Surprise! It's called Startup Different, the myth-busting blueprint for your multi-million-dollar business, and it's available now. Like our show, we're trying to pay it forward to our fellow entrepreneurs. The book busts 33 business myths, tells some of our most hilarious stories, and gives you many of our best tools to build, scale, and exit your business. You'll find the book on all major online retailers, including Amazon. Check it out. We think it's pretty great. And now, back to the show.
So not that one. So this one was an exciting experience. I was one of the first employees, one of the first sales reps, and had the experience of just going like this, just shooting for the moon, raising a bunch of venture capital, about 23 million in total.
Wow.
And then as fast as it went up, it kind of went down. And for a number of different reasons I won't get into. And so from there, I ended up actually relocating from Salt Lake City, where I'd spent 3 years after college, and I moved to San Francisco. So,
cool. Wow, you were living like the startup dream. Like you had like the boom bust startup, like the funding, like ran right off the runway and exploded. And then you were like, I'm going to go to San Francisco to get more into this. Is that kind of the gist of it?
That's it. Yeah. And as the first startup I was with was kind of crashing, I met some amazing people there, just incredibly talented team. And the feedback that I kept getting from them was, you're young, you're motivated. Like I had a lot of success on the sales side, and they were encouraging me, find something to go after, take a crack at it. And at that time, it was right around when Facebook took off, and venture capital was just flowing everywhere. And so I moved to San Francisco, was doing a little bit of consulting work and getting an idea off the ground. And I just started immersing myself in the scene there and listening to a bunch of the podcasts, which were new at the time, 2011.
You're saying this isn't a new idea, a business podcast?
It's just 13 years.
It's slightly saturated market with about 2 billion different podcasts. But anyway,
it's one of the best ones, though. So
hey, friend of the pod, confirmed.
There we go. Yeah. And so anyhow, long story longer, I ended up raising a small angel round, and I had an idea. I'd been working with law enforcement for 3 years on the data side. So integrating some of their antiquated data systems and doing analysis on it, selling those products. And doing that, I realized that a lot of the technology that they had was still analog, just like pen and paper, literally filling out reports, going back to the department, handing it to a secretary to input into a system if they had one. Right. And so I kicked around a few ideas, worked with engineers that I met out in the Bay Area. And after a couple of pivots, which is not atypical, ended up, I met a retiring a battalion chief of a fire department who had lung damage from all of the exposures that he had in his career. And he had to go through this arduous process of pulling together documentation on all of the exposures that he had throughout his career. Even though everybody knew it was job related, they couldn't set a precedent just saying, okay, you get all of you guys are in Canada, so you probably don't deal with this shit the way we do in America. But
maybe, hang on. We're also very bureaucratic, but keep going.
Okay. But so Chief Sovacool is his name, Clive Sovacool, amazing guy. He was retired out, and he was telling me, he's like, hey, why don't you use what you're building? Because what we were building was basically just a database to track a lot of their trainings and records that were still being tracked in paper. He's like, you could use this and help people like me out who I'm having to go through paper logbooks over his 20-year career, get Xerox copies of each one of them at every firehouse he'd been at in, quadruplicates, so that he can give one to his lawyer, the county, and so he threw that idea out, and I'm like, I think this is actually like, you're onto something. And so I ended up bringing him on board as a co-founder, even though I'd kind of been kicking it around for a while. What I was working on, I didn't have any traction yet. The product wasn't to market. And so Clive came on board as my co-founder at that time. And we ended up getting the product built finished it up in probably about 4 months, took it to market. And because we'd already been building the back end of it for a while. And I was playing around on force.com, if you guys remember that old version of Salesforce. Man.
That's a throwback. Yeah, for sure. Cool.
Yep. So I was building, and I am not technical whatsoever. And I was cranking away at that. And so anyway, Clive came on board, and he ended up, part of the reason we took it to market so quickly was he was a firefighter that just happened to be really good at managing product. And that was not my specialty. So, it's always good to find that yin to your yang. And if you don't have a brother that could write really good code, go find a firefighter.
Yeah, cool. That's actually our piece of advice for the show today.
That's right. And
very cool. Very cool. I mean, it's very important to find like kind of that complementary skill set in a co-founder. It is interesting though, because your product is so like technically focused. Like your development was still done by, like, were they in-house or were you just like contracting? How were you getting the actual work done on the actual coding? Who's doing that?
Yeah, so we were contracting it first, and it was kicks and starts, and the people I was in, it was really challenging, especially when you don't know how aligned their motivations are. And we ended up bringing on a couple of programmers who were kind of like mid-tier programmers, not 10Xers, but not junior guys. Sure. And they got us, helped us build out the MVP, and they hung around for a couple of years before they kind of moved on and did their next thing. And we got somebody that was more senior to run all the technical stuff. But
cool.
Once we launched,
traction. Sorry to interrupt. What kind of traction were you seeing here by this point? Because I'm just trying to put the timeline together. So you got your product, got your co-founder. You're a couple of years in. How many like agencies are you working with by this point?
Yeah. So by the time we launched that product, it was kind of my second pivot, but they were very similar as far as what, just a database that's tracking a lot of similar type of information. So I'd say as soon as we decided to go on the pivot of Exposure Tracker, we were about 6 months into that, even though I'd kind of been at it for about a year and a half myself. So 6 months into bringing Clive on board, and we launched it just weeks before one of the biggest firefighter conferences they have. It was luckily in San Diego, and I'd relocated from the Bay Area to San Diego around that time.
You were literally there. It was like in your backyard, basically. Cool.
Oh yeah, and it ended up doing really well at the show, and we got our first probably like 5 to 10 customers within a few months. And, it wasn't a crazy enterprise product, hundreds of thousands of dollars, but, it was like low thousands of dollars per year for each fire department that would come on based on how many firefighters they had.
Nice. So you had some like early traction. You had funding, I believe you mentioned too. You had the co-founder. So you're really on a strong path here. So how long did it take from, kind of some of that early market traction to get sort of what you definitely know what I'm talking about here, but the crossing the chasm, going from that sort of like early adopters to early majority, like what does that look like? And then how did you get to the actual, more serious acquisition stage?
Oh man. Well, what's funny is crossing the chasm, anybody that's listening to this, if you haven't read it, most people probably have, but it is, every startup goes through it. And one thing that we found was the first year we were growing very linearly, raised a little bit more money too. So after we launched the product and we had some success, we brought on a couple of like really awesome investors. So at that point I raised about 1.5 million from early stage VCs and some like super angels in the California area. And it was a slog. So the sales process, even though we were going in at a price point that is below the RFP bidding thresholds that these agencies have, it was something that they'd never purchased and never really thought about.
Totally.
So it was
either yeah, for sure. I want to hear it, but I think we're going to be like, I'm going to have like a reaction at some point, or I just start convulsing because it's like sounds so similar to what we were doing with that farmer. But take me through it.
Oh yeah, and so it was one of these things where we found that a lot of our customers, it was either like a fire chief or one of the command staff members who had dealt with cancer and had to go back to paper reports to substantiate their claim to get their benefits, like all of their co-pays and any like sick leave after they used up their sick leave. And this was just an issue that fire departments and firefighters across North America dealt with. And and it was really interesting. So one, I hope you don't mind if I tell a little story about our go-to-market strategy. And so originally we were thinking going to the unions, the firefighter unions would be probably the easiest path to being able to get into these agencies. But they were very concerned about how could the data ever possibly be used by like the city or the county they work for to maybe tell a firefighter, oh, you've had too many exposures. You can't be a firefighter anymore.
Wow. Oof. Yeah. That's a tough relationship, between the union and the not union. Let's just put it that way. But there's a lot of confrontation there. But you could see that path, or you could even see like an insurance company being like, well, you knew that you were too exposed by this point in your career. I mean, insurance companies are great at not paying insurance. That's their core competency. So you kind of feel like it's not unreasonable. But okay, so unions, I'm guessing that didn't really pan out then.
We would get some, but we realized like as we were taking that approach, we would get contacted by an assistant chief who's like, I just survived pancreatic cancer and it took 1.5 years for me to get my benefits covered and like my sick leave, like, or whatever, their particular case was. And one thing too that part of our go-to-market that we focused on is in the US, they have what's called presumption laws. So if you're a firefighter or a particular government employee and you get an illness that is a very high rate for that profession, like firefighters getting cancer and COPD and like other lung illnesses, if your state has presumption laws, it's presumed that the job either gave you the illness or contributed to it. And the burden of proof is then on the employer, which is usually the city or the county, to prove otherwise.
Okay.
And so
I will just say this is definitely a more American thing. Here you get sick, you go to the hospital, we probably hook you up. But I could see this getting pretty intense pretty fast.
It'd be funny enough, we would get Canadian fire departments all the time that would sign up and we're like, well, you guys are well taken care of. But the chiefs would say, I want to use everything I can to take care of my guys. And
that's cool. I respect that. And I should say
amazing.
Too, I respect the mission big time of what you're doing here. Like this is something that is really ending or at least helping mitigate a lot of misery, and I think and I don't want to get too off topic here because I am interested in your go-to-market, but I think from a mission perspective, your company was pretty clearly had a really good moral compass. We are doing something that helps people, that helps them manage their pain. And is honestly, you think about how, on Veterans Day or Remembrance Day or whatever, those days, thank you for your service. Well, these people, like, thank them for their service. And you were, I think, contributing to that thank you by helping them through these terrible conditions that they had as a result of doing the job, So.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
So I just wanted to throw that out. Chris, do you have anything to say about that?
I thought you said very nicely, Dave.
Okay. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Anyway, so okay, let's. So Canadian guys getting taken care of. Then your go-to-market, so these unions, and then what from there?
Yeah, and so originally we were thinking, okay, we're gonna target. There's 18,000 fire departments in the U.S., and we're gonna target the unions in states where they don't have presumption laws. And interestingly enough, if you look at the 50 states in the U.S., the presumption laws, it almost matches blue and red states.
Oh yeah.
Like
Political. Yeah. Okay.
Politically. And so we were focused on all these states in like the South and the middle of the country that didn't have those presumption laws, and using all of our digital ad spend and going to conferences and like cold calling in those areas. But while we were doing that, we would get calls from departments throughout California, Colorado, Canada, and the Northeast saying, even though we have presumption laws, we want to spend $5,000 a year on your software to just give our folks every tool they can for their health. So just two things, we thought the unions would be a good avenue and that go into states that don't have presumption laws, and it ended up being completely opposite. But we were so diligent in using our Salesforce, our CRM, and tracking all the data and being able to analyze where the leads are coming in, what the motivators were and all that. And so that's one thing that, you can't emphasize enough for young entrepreneurs when it comes to sales, is you got to be just maniacal about tracking as much of the data as you can so that you can really analyze a lot of the stuff. Ours was anecdotal enough to where we kind of understood that, but there's a lot of, insight that you could glean into go-to-market challenges you might have, that if your sales folks are not tracking that data, you're just not going to understand that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think when I think about when we decided to add a CRM back in the AppArmor days, was kind of when I couldn't keep track of it all in my head. I actually write about this in the book that is behind you, by the way. I see Startup Different behind you. Well done. And I remember being like, it gets complicated enough that you're like, I need to do something. I need to scale some of this. And also that creates the systems so you can have other reps and so that they can repeat that process and actually be good at their jobs too. But okay, so and also I had one other thought, and Chris Singleton, sorry, I got to clarify here. It makes me think of, how they, I don't know if you've ever seen this. There's the chart of where they reinforced airplanes. This is coming around, but where they reinforced airplanes in World War II, and all the aircraft would come back and they'd have all these holes in the wings and at the back, and they'd be like, okay, that's where we need to reinforce. But it was actually incorrect, right? Because the bias there was what they were seeing, where those were the airplanes that got back. The parts of the airplanes they needed to reinforce were all the parts that didn't have bullet holes in them, because that's where those planes were getting shot down. And I'm thinking about Chris Memmett's strategy here, where it's like you were going after this market and you were chasing the bullet holes in the wings, and you're like, well, clearly this is where we need to be. But actually, it ended up being this entirely other market, like this entirely other space, like totally on the opposite end of the spectrum, that was actually your customer.
So Chris, did you flip your strategy then at that point? Did you say, okay, forget the states that have or that don't have the presumption laws and instead go to the ones that do, if I got that right?
Exactly. We did exactly that. So the nice thing, I felt like we did a really good job of leveraging Facebook and Instagram ads and doing all that. And these firefighters love Instagram. So I was really hesitant to
wait, why do firefighters love Instagram?
Because they have a cool job and a lot of them are buff. So they like to show photos of
they want to be like,
their
hey,
job and their chiseled physiques. Exactly. Yeah. And so, and I was, because at first I was like, no, let's focus on LinkedIn and some of these more professional aspects. And then we had a couple of interns who were MBA students in the marketing side. And anyway, we would focus all of our ad spend from those, instead of the unions and the presumption states, to the departments and in states where they had the presumption laws, and the lead rate just really went up. And it was always kind of linear. We never hit that exponential growth. And one thing that we did see was the first year, the sales cycle was probably about like 3.5, 4 months for our average deal, with an average deal size of $3,500 a year. And so really low. I know. Yeah. And so we're okay. This might the unit economics, if we could condense the sales cycle down to a couple months, and instead of having it take 7 touch points and 2 demos, it down to like 4 touch points and automate a lot of that. Mm-hmm. And the challenge that we ran into was those were the early adopters. So those were the easy sells. So after that, we're like, oh, hell, now we really have to go back to the drawing board. And really focused on partnerships, any like B2B strategies that we could take, with partners in the space where we could be a value add. And we got a couple of insurance of deals with member-owned insurance companies for like long-term disability.
Okay.
And so that brought us a couple hundred departments, but it got to the point where we had all this interest from established companies in the space that, we're like, okay, if you're ever interested in M&A, let's have a conversation. And a few of those wells did not come through. So that's when I went to I had a 3-member board comprised of, one of our largest investors and an independent board member. And we realized, okay, I think the writing's on the wall. We just kind of plateaued, and I'd been at it for about 6 years myself. And so, being just broke as hell for 6 years, I was like wanting to I made so much more money when I was 23 years old out of college than I did as a founder. And so we engaged with a handful of potential buyers, and there were probably about 8 that showed some interest, a lot of tire kicking. And
that's a big pool. Like even just managing 8 different negotiations or even just calls here and there, like it's a lot. It's and we'll talk about this in a second, I'm sure, but like it's a lot of exposure too, right? Like there's a lot of companies that are learning like more about you that are potentially strategics, but okay. So you had 8.
Yeah. So of those 8 folks that would have convos, 3 of them were seriously interested, and it was all over the map as far as what the deals looked like. And we were really focused from day one on having a multi-tiered earnout of sorts. Because, when you raise money from VCs, you got to, they get the preferred shares. They get the first $1.5 million back.
Right.
And while our economics didn't get to the point where we could sell for a huge multiple of that, we had a lot of opportunity we had about 38,000 users on our platform by the time we sold.
Right. Nice.
And most of those through these large deals with a couple of insurance companies where, it was massively discounted, but it brought users onto the platform, which adds a lot of value. And so we negotiated and ended up getting 3 term sheets all over the map. One was much more of an actual merger and, very little or no cash up front, just stock on stock deal.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's interesting. Yeah. Like basically hiring you if you've been bringing you in-house sort of idea. Is that correct? Or
basically, yeah. And getting enough stock enough equity within the company for it to be meaningful for myself, my co-founder. Although, at the time I was like, okay, this isn't of the 3, that was actually the one that was by far the riskiest. And then another company, a big hardware company, they expressed quite a bit of interest, and they, interestingly enough, couldn't tell us at the time, but they were in the process of going public. And we didn't know that. And that was going to be some cash up front and some, a good chunk of equity in their company for our employees and our investors, and then other factors to make it juicier. And then the other one was, I can't really go into too much details, but the acquirer we went with is a private equity backed group out of Indiana called Envisage Technologies. Amazing team. And we were able to negotiate a deal with them where we're okay, we feel really great about taking care of the investors and having a lot of upside for everybody, including me and Clive, my co-founder. And we signed a term sheet with them, and I'm not sure how it was with Rave, the difference between what your term sheet looked like and what your purchase agreement looked like.
Not bad actually. Pretty close, I would say.
The important stuff was the same.
The important stuff was there. Yeah.
There could be a difference between hundreds of pages in length.
Oh, yeah. Definitely. Yeah. Oh, yeah. It was a big lawyer exercise to get through a stack about this big, of paper. But yeah.
And that's not an exaggeration. So, some of these term sheets we had were 7 pages long, and I forget exactly what it was with our acquirer, but we, so the term sheet is, oh, great. And then, then the lawyers jump in.
Yeah.
And it is just insane where it's like, how did this, in I mean, the due diligence process that you go through during an acquisition it's like raising a round of funding from VCs on steroids.
Oh, that's interesting. Because we never did that, right? And we had the due diligence ourselves. In fact, there's a section of the book called "Due Diligence Sucks," and it's specifically because it's so brutal. But okay,
yeah. Absolutely. So, I mean, it was, and not that they were. There was anything that they did that was not ethical or like. But once the lawyers get in, and like I remember somebody, I don't know if it was one of their lawyers or their private equity firm, somebody one time said on a call, we're approaching every acquisition we do the same, whether it's $1 million acquisition or $100 million acquisition.
Oh,
and
man.
I was like, oh, okay. So, I mean, it took so much longer than I could have imagined. But they were extremely sophisticated. They did their job, they dotted every I, they checked every T, and the deal got done. And so, we ended up getting acquired by them. And one thing with me was I had been working so hard on this for like 6 years that I was really focused on a shorter earnout for myself. So I stayed around for about 6 months after the acquisition, and then was able to take some time off and kind of reboot.
Chris, approximately how long was your due diligence period in months? How long did that take?
Oh, I want to say 6 months, because it just felt like an eternity, but it might have been closer to 4.
Yeah. So ours ended up being about 2 months, Dave.
Yeah.
And I remember our lawyers, when they saw the timeline, they just told us flat out, this is impossible. It's not possible to do this in this time frame. And I don't know how, but actually, I think what worked well for Dave and I was that we didn't tell any of our staff of what was going on. So all the due diligence was the two of us. And frankly, we knew that business inside out. So we were probably the most efficient people at filling the data room and filling out all the documentation that they needed. And I think our lawyers actually said that afterwards. They said, it was just because you guys were so responsive. That's why it got done, because, they would give us something, at 4:00, and by the next morning, it would be ready to go by 9 a.m. So, we were just really on top of everything. Yeah.
Yeah. Due diligence is brutal though. And I can imagine, like, your team was, out of curiosity, was your team fully aware that the acquisition was happening, or was it just something you managed with your co-founder? Like, how did that go?
No, we were very transparent, and because I was doing the typical venture route where we burned a lot of money early on to try to maximize growth, and then it just slowly was just a slowly monthly burn, and we were going after these wells. So we were very transparent, like, okay, if we don't close a couple of these deals and we don't raise more capital, which I didn't have the energy to do another raise that might have been a down round. So the writing was on the wall. So we were very transparent about that.
Let me ask you a question, and I don't want you to take it the wrong way, but if you were to look back on this experience, one of the things that Chris and I are very skeptical of, particularly for software companies, is raising capital. And just the way you're talking about it, I can't really tell if you're like, this was a good idea or a bad idea. Do you think in retrospect, you shouldn't have raised, or that raising and getting the investors on board was the right way to do it?
It was necessary for me, because I just being non-technical, and
sure, you needed the capital to pay to get the development going and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we did finally bring in-house developers on, that's when it like went like this with the product.
Right.
So I don't think I could have gotten it. Yeah, I can say certainly at that time I wouldn't have been able to accomplish what we did without raising.
Right.
But the nice thing is, having gone through that, now I'm confident, if I do another software venture, I'd be able to do quite a bit before needing to raise money and just being able to self-fund it.
Yeah.
So it was like one of those chapters where it's like, okay, maybe that was a necessary evil to get my skill set to where it needs to be for something down the road.
I think that's a good way to put it. Necessary evil.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, if you don't have to do it, then don't. But if you have to, then plug your nose.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I think you're right. I think the piece too is that we had, I was able to write a lot of the code. So we were able to get our product to a certain, level before we had to start hiring developers. So, just we did it in sweat instead of
your time was worthless, right? So well, okay. So last question for you today, and then we'll wrap it up. So obviously our audience, and thanks for sharing your journey, by the way, this is really, really cool. But so our audience obviously is interested in startup myths and things that sort of surprised maybe you or things that maybe you'd say to them, everybody thinks is true, but isn't really. So do you have a startup myth that you want to share with us today?
Yeah, absolutely. And so it's kind of funny because there's this middle ground on, as a founder or a member of a founding team, what you can pay yourself. And I remember when I started, everybody was saying, oh, pay yourself absolutely as little as you can. Whatever you need to survive down to the penny, do that. And I took it literally. And at the time I was living in San Francisco. And so even though I'd raised a little bit of angel money at the time, I want to say I was living off of $2,100 a month.
Wow.
Something.
Holy.
3 roommates. Wow. 3 roommates. My car was paid off. Like I didn't have many bills outside of $900 a month rent in 2011 in San Francisco. Can't imagine what it's like now with
that's $3,000 now. But anyway, okay.
But the amount of stress that you're going to have as a startup founder is insane. But like you can't pay yourself if there's no money in the bank. But if you do go the route of raising money, you can pay yourself enough to not live in poverty, basically.
Yeah.
And I keep running, like just in the last month, I ran into 2 very talented entrepreneurs here in Austin, Texas, where I'm living now. Mm-hmm. And learning about what they're doing, they're amazing. Their products are great. I think they're going to be great, like very successful, but both of them are not paying themselves anything, even though they've raised money. And one of them has raised quite a bit of money. And I was concerned, and like, that stress, like you should be comfortable paying yourself a $75,000 salary if you've raised $1 million.
Yeah.
And,
100%.
But then you see the flip side where you see some people they want to keep paying themselves $250,000 salary like they were making at Google before they left. And unless you raise stupid VC money, they don't care. You got to find that middle ground. So I think that for a seed stage company, any founder, if you've raised over $1 million, you should be comfortable paying yourself at least $75,000 following that raise.
I like that. What do you think of that, Chris?
Yeah, that's great. Great myth to bust.
Yeah, I think
something.
Because, your time is worth it.
Yeah, absolutely. And you don't want to feel bad about yourself every day you're going into work for your startup.
Yeah,
you want to be, you're right. You don't want to go overboard, but you want to be like, no, I'm a person. I'm happy with how I'm doing.
I got it. You ready for this? You ready?
Okay.
You want to be hungry, but you don't want to be starving. Whew. Oh. You heard it here first, folks. I started different. Yeah. Quick, where's the book? Can we edit that into the book?
Anyway, is that in the book?
Yeah, that's okay. Chris, thank you so much for joining us. Love the story, love the myth. Thank you so much. And folks, thank you for joining us again for another episode of Startup Different. We will catch you next week.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
This is the Startup Different podcast. From scrappy founders to 8-figure success stories, we're busting apart startup myths, getting raw insights from battle-tested entrepreneurs, and revealing the proven playbook for bootstrapping your way to $5 million with no VC strings attached.